Swinburne University of Technology.
Hello students of Masters and PhDs in Writing. We're here today to talk about practice-led or practice-based research, which is a fairly basic umbrella term for the methodology that we use bringing our practice to the academy, taking our writer's voice or our creative voice in whatever genre we're working into our academic voice. And this is quite an interesting and important part of working with an artefact and an exegesis within scholarship. Perhaps the most difficult thing people find when they're doing this is to go from their practice to their exegesis or to their scholarly voice. But all of our students who've actually done it have said it also has a backflow effect and it helps them as practitioners. So practice-led research is a really important way that we bring creativity into the academy. And this umbrella term is a really interesting one for us to unpack today, I think. Dominique, do you agree with that?
Certainly, yeah.
What sort of things do you think about practice-led based research?
Well, practice-led research is usually understood as a kind of a method rather than a methodology, whereby the artifact or the work of art actually drives the research. So you start mucking around in your studio, or you start writing poems or stories, and then the ideas come to you, and you start your research, your more formal research. And what is interesting is that then there a kind of a dialectic between the two processes comes into play. And I would say that it's more than a dialectic, because the actual research is a third element. So what you find in the process is a kind of the product of the triangulation between the two processes. That's the way I see it. Yeah. And one of the hurdles, the first hurdle is actually to trust the process, because people don't like to go out in the dark.
I think that's very insightful, don't you, Carolyn, that trusting the process?
Very much so, and I think that there are certainly a set of steps that you can take to assist the process along to demystify it somewhat. And Jen Webb talks about that quite well in terms of research into practice, for practice and through practice, not necessarily in that order. But yeah, some of the things to think about are, developing up a question you want to interrogate. It doesn't have to be the traditional research question. It can be something along the lines of, how might I create stronger dialogue for my character? And so you could then look at how other writers would do that. So you're researching into the other cultural products in the field, and then you might reflect on that in your journal, which is a tool we might want to talk about in a minute. And then you can go back and test out those techniques that other writers have used in your work, and then take another step back and look at the broader theory around dialogue, like from narratology, focalization, what sort of vernacular language you're going to use, these things from a more theory perspective, rather than what other writers are doing, what theorists have said, and then talk about that in your journal, and then go back and play with those ideas in your artifact, whether it's a novel or your poems. So there is a step-by-step process going on, and you're engaging with different types of research.
And Dr. Dominique Heck is a very established researcher in this area and a supervisor of candidates. Dr. Carolyn Beasley also, and we have a newcomer to this area who can bring new insights to it, Dr. Julian Novitz. What do you think about practice-led research as you've seen it now, Julian?
Yeah, we'll step back from some of the specifics of the method and sort of look at it again as this umbrella term. I mean, it's really a way of framing non-academic types of writing within an academic context, or an academic framework. So novels, poetry, plays, personal memoir. It's a way of finding an approach to create and understand those sorts of works within a university, within a tradition of scholarly research. So.
And also, of course, not only that written textuality in discourse, but the broader elements of textuality of discourse, of online discourses, of artistic endeavours, visual endeavours. So it's a very encompassing way that we look at writing within our group, I think. And Dominique, what do you think are some of the steps that people might take to do PLR for themselves? I think the journal is probably a very important one, dear.
The journal is the equivalent of a studio for a painter, so that's really where you muck around or you play, as Carolyn says, where you jot down ideas, you sketch down settings, and you also document your theoretical readings or your readings of other books, because sometimes quotations from other novels or other works of fiction are very helpful to actually help you develop your technique. And it's important to note these things down, because as you engage in the process, you actually assimilate some of what you've been reading, and you actually transform these words, and also you think you will remember where to find these things, but memory plays little tricks on you, and so it's very important.
Yes, yes. I think that for me, the journal that the student takes is the observation of his or her work, and for me it joins the two elements, the artefact and the exegesis. And I've said instead of an 11, they're an H. They're joined together, and the journal provides ideas, issues, and as Dominique says, things that you might otherwise forget. It's a kind of a Baroque thing that happens, that the journal throws up issues that you can then utilise to make sections of your exegetical material. Do you think that's
very much so. And what's interesting too is the idea that within PLR you can also use other approaches, methods or methodologies. So you might be looking at representing or exploring feminism or post-colonialism as a theory that feeds into your writing, and you might think, well, I can't use that because my method is PLR, but these theories and approaches can sit within PLR as well. Does anyone want to pick?
It's a very broad umbrella term, isn't it, Julian? What do you think of those kind of methodological and theoretical questions that you're fronting now as a new supervisor within this practice-led, practice-based research?
Well, essentially, I mean, as Dominique and Carolyn were saying, I mean, as you go through the journaling process, the act of sort of writing and thinking your way into the artifact will throw up these methodological and theoretical questions that need to be addressed, that you could possibly profitably address in the exegesis. So you'll find your artifact will, through the process of going through practice-led research, your artifact will raise questions and problems that can be addressed through academic theories and methodologies as well.
And I think it's clear from what Julian and what Dominique and Carolyn have said that this enriches your own understanding of your works as a practitioner, so that you come to it thinking, yes, I am a writer of historical fiction, and you are, and you may well be a well-published writer of historical fiction, but you now begin to see things that you do or think about that are enriched by going to other people. So that kind of research is really important, isn't it?
Sometimes it can be quite technical. For instance, I had a student who used quantum physics as part of his general theoretical frame, but coming back to historical fiction, I was just thinking of a thesis I've examined, which was about the first woman who actually flew in Australia, and the person, the biographer, had to actually learn how to fly a plane. So it takes you interesting places. So
very cool.
That's experiential research as well as intellectual research.
I had a wonderful student who did one on madness, and she went and looked at the history of madness and at some archives about madness, and she found this little girl's dress. And the little girl had been imprisoned in a madhouse, as they were there in the 19th century. And inside the collar, a mother had put soft material so the little girl's neck wouldn't be chafed by the institutional canvas dress. And so she experienced those things, which she had experienced in her writing, but she then, because of the demands of scholarship, she wanted to take it further. Julie, I interrupted you.
So, no, I think that just sort of exemplifies how expansive the research component of practice-led research can be, in that working in your artefact will take you to maybe more unexpected places than a conventionally sort of defined academic research question might. It might require actually a wider field of engagement and reading and research that encompasses not just sort of traditional scholarship, but investigation of objects, practical skills, personal history, and so forth. So, yeah.
Yet it always has to be mired in some sort of academic context as well. We can't just have it looking like a journal entry. The journal entry is where you get your initial data and then you put it in a broader context.
That's right, and in a deeply theoretical context. And I always think of that theoretical context as you are at a dinner table with a lot of very interesting theoreticians, and you don't want to just sit there and be giving them coffee while they talk to one another. You're actually talking to them and discussing them, not just putting their names down to support a point that you have made. So it's a very rich dialogue that you can enter into with scholars in the same area that you're already involved in.
And Dominique mentioned examining thesis. What sorts of things do we think examiners look for in a PLR based or focused exegesis or PhD?
Well, it's certainly not easy. It's certainly not the easy option of the theoretical model, of the traditional model. Not that we don't do the traditional model also, and not that you can't apply practice-led research to the traditional model. But examiners, I think, look for a very high quality artefact, and they have all commented in my examination reports on the fact that statements or ideas or issues that are brought forward about the practice lead to theory. Would you agree with that in general terms?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I must confess that I always read the artifact first,
And I think you
unless
should,
the
yes.
student specifies it otherwise. And talking to colleagues, I know that's what they do as well. And then what I'll be looking for in the exegesis is the contribution to knowledge, which will be illuminated by the artifact I've just written. So what I get some kicks from reading innovative and experimental exegesis. So this is to say that people need to take risk.
And I think the very important point that comes out of what you have just said is that the exegesis is not the scholarly justification for the artefact. The two sit together, must talk to one another. All examiners say the two elements must sit together, must talk to one another, must enrich one another and enrich scholarship and learning. So the artefact enriches scholarship because it brings creativity into the academy, and the exegesis brings the two together into a very rich mix. So it's not, write a book and then I'll write the scholarly bit. The two together are scholarship. Would you agree with that, Joy?
Yep.
Very much so, yeah. And that can be something that it takes a student a while to get their head around as well. I think this idea that they both need to be contributing something, but one doesn't take precedence over the other.
And I think of it like an egg. You know, you don't think the egg consists of the yolk and the albumen. The egg is the egg. So although the egg has two parts, it is one. So it's the same sort of thing. It is a whole thing. So you don't get 50 or 60% for one or 50 or 60% for the other. You get the two together.
And so when we're writing up an exegesis, do we put in a separate methodology section that talks about PLR? Do we weave it through? What have your experiences been about how best to account or explain your method or methodology in an exegesis, and where does it go?
I would say it depends on the project. I don't insist that there is a chapter on the methodology, and sometimes the methodology is embedded in the whole exegesis, which is fine, provided you state it up front, that is in the introduction. Then you can argue with your examiners if they disagree with the way you go about it. But I think that each project has a particular internal logic which is reflected in the methodology.
That's right, and I think it's very important to me now my experience tells me that the exegesis should not be a mini artifact. There has been some discussion in writing, teaching areas saying make the exegesis more open, more creative, more like a creative piece. And that may well be an interesting way to go about it, but examiners tend not to say that.
Yeah.
So in the long run, the exegesis and artefact are aiming to get you the highest academic qualification, or one of the highest academic qualifications. So that's our aim. From that may grow many things. The exegesis could be developed into another book or into something quite different, as the artefact could be, or something different could happen. What do you think?
Yeah, yes. I mean, the important thing to keep in mind about the exegesis is that I suppose part of it is discussing how the artefact came together and what influenced it, and the process that you as a writer went through in creating that. But that isn't all the exegesis should be doing. It should also be, I suppose, explaining the other issues that your artefact speaks to, the other writers or theories or approaches, and it could lead to articles that might, I suppose, that might look at these topics in a more kind of critical or theoretical framework, or, as I think Josie says, the start of another book or an entirely different project. So, yeah, I mean, the important thing I think about the exegesis is that it shouldn't just be a commentary necessarily on the artefact, the creative artefact itself. But
Takes it somewhere further into scholarship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all about context too, putting it in the context of the various influences you had, the other works that have come before the genre, how your work is different or contributes to the genre in a new way, how you're using broader theories, not just about I did this like this.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think Dominique made an interesting point that as an examiner, and I too, would read the artefact first. As a supervisor, I'm pretty keen to get my candidates to write or do the artefact first. I don't think the other way works in any way as well. It can be done, but I think it is quite a lot more rigid and would need quite a lot more rearranging. What do you think, Dominic?
Yeah, I would agree with you, because then the artifact illustrates the theory, and I think it's the wrong way to approach theory.
And it's not bringing creativity to the academy, is it? It's sort of allowing creativity still to be the subject of the studies of the academy, instead of one of the great aims of practicum is to have the academy recognise that creativity is part of knowledge within scholarship. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I think that raises an interesting point for me that I've noted throughout my time as a student and talking to other students doing a PLR-based exegesis, PhD, and also as a supervisor, is that you should really listen to your supervisor.
Very good. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Because there'll be a time when you've written your artefact and you don't fully understand what the exegesis is. You may have looked at them, but this is your first time that you've met an exegesis. We've met many of them.
That's right.
We've worked them through. We've talked how examinations work with amongst ourselves with other examiners. We examine other theses from other universities. So whilst this is your first time, it is possibly our 10th, 11th, 20th. So you want to be putting some stock into when we say you need more academic references or you need to have something stronger here. And whilst we'll always respect the direction you want to take your work in, it's our job to help that work be shored up more academically, and that's something I think it can take students a while to understand.
Yes, I think now students and candidates, you've probably listened to a fair bit of stuff that you won't need immediately, but that we hope will help you in this setting out or going into this process. But just in case there's a last little piece of wisdom anyone wants to convey, Julian, do you have a last piece of wisdom? Boy, that's putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Julian always has wisdom.
I'm not sure, really. Yeah.
Well, I would
We
say,
say-
pay attention to your language, because often there is a discrepancy between the artifact and the exegesis, and the language of the exegesis is well doctored, it's beautiful, and there tends to be some sloppiness in the exegesis, which doesn't need to be. I mean, it's our job as writers to honour language.
Yes.
So that's
Oh, beautifully said. Carol?
Yep. Yeah, I think read. Don't be afraid to read other exegesis. I always give my students one to start off with when they first enrol. I know that they won't really look at it, or they won't know what they're seeing. But I come back to it a couple of times in the candidature and say, let's have a look at this. Remember this, and at the end, remember this. And about the third, about three. Or about the last third of the candidature, students really start to respond to other exegesis and say, oh yes, this was so helpful. So, trust us when we say, take this, keep it close by, and you may refer to it later.
Oh, I think I've got my wisdom now. Don't be afraid to start writing. I think that's a good piece of advice for all PhDs in every field or area. It's never too early to start putting words down on the computer, on paper, and I suppose that's part of like a component of practice-led research. Essentially, I mean, you will find the project gets easier the further you get into it. The more material you give yourself, the more material you'll have to rework later on. So. I think a big hurdle for a lot of PhDs is getting stalled at the reading stage, at the research stage, at thinking that you have to get your head around every possible issue or topic before you can actually start putting your own words down. And it's always more profitable to start writing and then realise where you're going wrong or where you need to do more research or more reading in order to get to the next step. So,
well, I have a few pieces. The first is don't drag it out too long. It gets stale, so try to do it within time or as quickly, and focus on it as much as you can. I love Google Scholar. If you're looking, there's hardly anything that scholars haven't had a little discussion about. And so Google Scholar or EBSCO or those kinds of online things can give you the most up-to-date scholarly discussions about the issues that you're looking at. I'm not saying don't go back to the foundational people. So all of those things are really important to me, and I wish you luck in your future. I thank you, Dominique, Carolyn, myself, Josie Arnold, Professor of Writing, and Julian. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
This has been a Swinburne production.